Hello, everybody. I'm Brian Levine. Welcome to the Gould Standard, a podcast brought to you by the Glenn Gould Foundation. And we're here once again bringing you conversations with some of the most remarkable people from all across the world of the arts. While you're stopping by under our fabulous flickering neon piano sign, please do take a moment to press like, share, and subscribe. And for the visually inclined among you, please check out the Glenn Gould Foundation's YouTube channel for a growing library of episodes that you can watch as well as hear. Speaking of which, if you like what you're hearing, please go to glenngould.ca, our very own website, click the donate button, and give generously to the Glenn Gould Foundation. We're a registered charity, and we do rely on your generous gifts. Now today, as we continue our celebrations of Glenn Gould at 90, we're absolutely delighted to welcome a man who knew Glenn Gould and worked closely with him on one of his most important projects for radio. We'll explore that, but we'll also want to talk about David's remarkable career as a composer during a golden age of adventure and experimentation in contemporary and electronic music, when Canada was at the leading, some might say bleeding edge, of the new, and his history-making career as a radio producer, as the creative force behind CBC's 2 New Hours, which had an incredible run of 29 continuous years. So I'm so delighted to be welcoming David Jaeger. David, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Brian.
Now, David, you were born in Wisconsin. I have to say, not a place that I think of it at first blush as a hotbed of new music experimentation and the avant-garde. But you got your Bachelor of Music degree at Madison. What were your early musical influences, and how did you actually develop a passion for new music, electronic composition, and the collision between music and technology?
Well, you mentioned my bachelor degree was completed at Madison. The campus of the University of Wisconsin at Madison is, of course, the main campus, the University of Wisconsin. And it's a big school. It had a music faculty of some 600 students in those days. This was in the late 1960s. And, just in your introduction, you reminded me that the Wisconsin Union, the main sort of social focus on campus in those days, had a beautiful theater. And I believe Glenn did appear there when he was still recording concerts. Because the funny thing was, when Glenn and I met at the CBC, this was in 1974. He soon met my wife, Sally, who is also a Wisconsin girl. And he, with the guessing games Glenn loved to play, he said, "I'm guessing from your voice that you must have originated somewhere around Appleton, Wisconsin." Appleton being a town about 100 miles north of Madison.
Uh-huh.
And then it's a town that also has a well-known music conservatory. Lawrence Conservatory is in Appleton, Wisconsin. And in fact, so she and I both grew up in a small town about 30 miles north of Appleton. So he, his instincts were spot on, and she was delighted and rather impressed by that observation. But yes, the campus of the University of Wisconsin in those days, there were, for example, I think my freshman year, Rudolph Kolisch, the violist of the Fine Arts Quartet, was in residence in the music school. And he had arranged for Renee Leibowitz to come in and visit for a term. And, one of the most thrilling experiences I had as an undergraduate was singing in the University of Wisconsin concert choir in a concert with Renee Leibowitz conducting the Schoenberg's Friede auf Erden. Unforgettable experience. And so, I guess suppose it helped to cement my my own personal uh, line of connection with the Second Viennese School,
Mm-hmm.
and with contemporary thought at the time. I must say that before I arrived as an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin, my I would say principal pipeline to cultural matters was probably Wisconsin Public Radio,
Mm-hmm.
which, of course, was produced largely in Madison at their
Mm-hmm.
headquarters. But in fact, there were stations around the state at the various smaller campuses, the satellite campuses of the University of Wisconsin. But I remember, for example, having heard John Cage uh, before I entered university. I heard an interview on Wisconsin Public Radio on the topic of the prepared piano, uh,
Ah.
an interview with John Cage in which he laid out his complete um, thinking on why the prepared piano and how to use it, and a little bit about the repertoire that he had created. And ironically, many years later, when I was working with Glenn and helping to create these 10 programs that we made on Arnold Schoenberg to celebrate the centenary of Schoenberg's birth in 1974, John Cage was one of the people that Glenn chose to interview.
Mm-hmm.
And curiously, I actually worked with Cage subsequently more than a few times. Um, so, I met him on air, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
And
Did you confide in him that he had been your gateway drug to the world of contemporary music?
yes, I did share that with him. And of course, with John, he was such a nice person,
Mm-hmm.
and a very gentle soul, a very patient and kind man, but with a powerful intellect.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, we got along extremely well. My name is Jaeger, which means in German it means hunter,
Yes.
and my the German side of my family, my roots go back to the Black Forest, the Schwarzwald. My father was
Mm-hmm.
a first generation American, born of German immigrants. And, if you're in the Black Forest, everything bears the hook, Jaeger this and Jaeger that, because
Yes.
of course the forest is filled with hunters
Right.
out seeking game. So forgive me if this is just a slightly lengthy interjection, but it's quite fascinating. John Cage was a very serious very serious amateur mycologist,
Hmm.
and his knowledge of mushrooms was extremely well known and highly respected.
Hmm.
And so I shared with John Cage, I think on our, maybe not our first meeting, but probably our second meeting, I mentioned to him that when I had been to Donaueschingen in the Black Forest, that I was surprised to notice right off the train, a few steps from the train station, I noticed there's a Jägerstube. It's not, easy
Yeah.
to find. And we went inside and we saw on the menu that you could order a Jägersuppe or a
Mm-hmm.
Jaeger schnitzel. And of course, anything bearing the name Jaeger in cuisine meant mushrooms.
Ah.
And so I shared the conjecture with John Cage in one of these early meetings. I said, when the hunter goes out and returns empty-handed, he's left with foraging, with gathering the mushrooms to provide something for the meal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this is why the cuisine bearing the name Jaeger is always mushrooms, just like in Italian. If you have cacciatore,
Yes.
chicken cacciatore is with mushrooms, or
Mm-hmm.
in France, if it's a chasseur, you know. So, and he said this was an entirely plausible conjecture, and he accepted my position on that. So you can see we had a very easy, cordial, friendly relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And so when Glenn laid out his plans for the celebration of the Schoenberg centenary, of course it became important to speak to people who knew Arnold Schoenberg, who had worked with Arnold Schoenberg. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, John Cage went and sought out Schoenberg and convinced him to take him, Cage, as his Schoenberg's student. And so the interview dwelled on that relationship
Mm-hmm.
when we made that particular broadcast. So Glenn had told me that, you know, his three avatars in music were Bach, Richard Strauss, and
Yes.
Schoenberg. And so this occasion of the centenary was very important to him.
It's absolutely fascinating. Now, you were in Wisconsin. What brought you to Toronto, and what would that have been, around 1970?
That's right. At the end of my undergraduate career, I competed for and won a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. And it's actually, you know, the foundation, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, still exists. It's an international foundation based in Princeton, New Jersey. They've changed their name. The fellowship is, but it's the same. It's the same principle. They were actually
Uh-huh.
they were encouraging people who were they deemed to be excellent communicators and who held the potential of being the teachers of tomorrow. So they were looking for people entering graduate school who might in some way help to support and increase and strengthen the teaching profession. Well, you know, when I became a radio music producer at the CBC, starting in 1973, you know, thinking back on what brought me to Toronto, um, because it was the University of Toronto who saw my name on a
Mm-hmm.
list of Woodrow Wilson laureates,
Yep.
and who contacted me, in fact, and said, would I like to come and study at the Faculty of Music, University of Toronto? So coming with this in mind, and working my way gradually into broadcasting, and as you mentioned in your introduction, I did create a network radio program, long running show called 2 New Hours. And we did, in the course of making those broadcasts, create original content and share that content, world premieres with listeners across the country. So I
Mm-hmm.
did. This is kind of coming the long way around, but to say that I finally, in reflecting on this, I thought, well, you know, I didn't actually teach in a classroom, but I think I had a very large constituency
Mm-hmm.
with whom to share the information and the music and the whole creative act with.
Right.
And so I feel there was no betrayal of the confidence that the Woodrow Wilson Foundation had in me.
Well, I promise we're not going to rat you out, and I think it's probably a little late in the day to do that anyway. That you took it under false pretenses, but seriously though, the University of Toronto Faculty of Music at the time, and in fact the whole Toronto scene, was really a ferment of new music activity. There was a generation, and more than a generation. You know, there are the precursor artists who were laying the groundwork as early as the 50s, and they were still around. And then those who were coming after them. And there was a great deal of experimentation with electronics going on. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems as though along with perhaps a half a dozen other places, Toronto was really one of the vanguard places in the world for experimentation and new music creation. Am I overselling us?
No, you're absolutely spot on, Brian. And this was one of the, when I got that phone call, I was still in my student residence in Madison, Wisconsin, having been named a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, and Harvey Olnick called
Who
me,
I knew quite well. Yes.
a distinguished musicologist and scholar, and one of the people who actually was the initiators of the establishment of the University of Toronto Electronic Music Studio. Harvey Olnick, along with Arnold Walter, who was dean at the time, and Myron Schaefer. These were the people who felt it was important to strike out in this new direction. The Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Studio already existed, but the U of T, they called it UTEMS, UTEMS, the University of Toronto Electronic Music Studio, was in fact the second studio to be opened in North America. A few years after, European radio stations in Cologne, in Milan, in Paris, and so on.
Right, Paris would have been EarCam, right?
Well, actually, it was the OR
before.
It was the ORTF. It was Pierre Schaeffer.
Oh yes.
And the EarCom came along a decade or two later, but certainly carried on in that tradition,
right?
As a leading international center for research and development of new music, and remains as such.
Right. Well, just because we are in such a different world when it comes to electronics, digital technology, synthesizing sounds, repurposing and processing sounds, sampling sounds, and all of the rest of it. But it must, from today's perspective, feel terribly primitive what you had to work with. But on the other hand, when you consider that the history of electronic instruments goes back to the 1920s with the theremin and the Onde Martineau and a few other tube devices.
The Trautonium.
Yes. You must have felt like you were really on the edge of a brave new world with all sorts of devices. And I saw this special purpose tape machine with something like a dozen reels hanging off the side of it. These were things that you or your colleagues were literally inventing on the fly, right?
Well, we were lucky at UTEMS, if I can use that anagram freely. At UTEMS, we were lucky to have the collaboration of a genius, a Canadian inventor genius by the name of Hugh LeCain, who in the post-Second World War years, at his lab at the National Research Council in Ottawa, a lab which during the war had worked on the establishment of sonar and radar,
right,
and had made important contributions to that developing technology. Hugh LeCain was a very gifted amateur musician, had a great love for music, and when in the post-war period, when the urgency to create defensive and weaponry and technology to defend the nation, he gravitated towards music and invented, in fact, the first portable synthesizer, which he called the sackbut. Yeah. And many other devices, including that special purpose tape machine, which was a loop player. It had a keyboard. It was a tempered keyboard. It had multiple spools and multiple what's called capstans, which is the thing that comes down, clamps on the tape, and applies the moving force to it, and draws it over the playback head, which you could then change the pitch, and you can have as many as 8 loops going at the same time, and each loop could be of a different length.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, looping was very much already on the scene in those days. And Hugh LeCain he would come down from Ottawa to visit us at UTEMS, I would say more or less monthly.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to know, what did the students feel they were missing? What did they need for their creative work, for their studies, and their work going forward? And so there was kind of an open conversation, an ongoing conversation with Dr. LeCain, uh, and uh, and he was an inventor. He was an inventive person,
Mm-hmm.
as an inventor would need to be, and he was interested in the discussion and interested in applying his knowledge, his talent, his understanding of electronics to finding solutions. I know there was a device that arrived while my class of students were there, where he had built a whole panel of touch sensitive conductors, and each one was connected to an oscillator. So it was a bank of, I think, something like 200 oscillators, and they were all accessed by touch sensitivity.
Ah.
And we discovered, actually, the way that technology worked was a combination not only of pressure and heat from touching, but also of moisture. So you could actually breathe on these things and create a cluster effect. You get all of them sounding simultaneously just by breathing on them.
With that heat and moisture, boy, you could have actually rigged that thing up to be a good lie detector.
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, it's really fascinating. I think again for people who are used to buying, devices that do everything right off the shelf, and you never really have to worry about it. The level of artfulness, of ingenuity, of um, belt and suspenders, whacking things together and hoping and praying that they'll. But that actually it's something I've heard you speak about, which is the transition from being able to create exciting original works of music that could only exist in a recorded environment to getting to the point where you could actually create new music using electronic instruments or electronics combined with acoustical instruments in live performance. Was that kind of a big sort of threshold for the art to come across?
Well, I think it was. Um, I and my fellow graduate students who were working at the time in the studio, and these were the years 1970, 1971, 1972. We were all composers. We were all doing composition degrees, uh, and we had our electronic studio course, but we also had another course with John Weinswag, where writing notes on paper, and
Mm-hmm.
studying the art of writing. But the distance between notes on a page and just working with media, with electronic devices, working with your ears and responding, suggested very strongly that there would be a kind of a performance
Yeah,
element to this
for
activity,
sure.
because even if it was twiddling knobs and adjusting dials, or using that special purpose tape player, moving up and down the frequency spectrum, you had to do it. You would do it yourself, and curiously, uh, the combination of being in with that equipment, and being uh, very focused on creating original work with it, but having to share studio time with other students, it became very collegial.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, all of us had not only composition but also performance backgrounds, so it was inevitable that someone was going to come up with the suggestion that, well, why don't we let's unscrew some of these gadgets from the rack, and let's take them outside and take them on stage and, create some work that's meant to be performed with these very unconventional instruments. So we did it exactly that in the earliest years. And it's funny, we would work all hours of the day and the night. Oftentimes after midnight, there were the four of us because there are actually two studios in UTEMS. One was the kind of the introductory studio, and then there was like a more advanced, we called it the big kids studio.
Uh-huh.
When Stockhausen came to visit in the 1970s, he came down, and of course he was shown the advanced studio.
Yes.
And he got a pulse wave going, rotating around the four speakers of the advanced studio, and we just stood there listening and watching him adjust the frequency and the wave shape of these pulses that he had going. And I remember when he stopped to pause at one point, I asked him about his plan for his work.
Mm-hmm.
And his answer was really caught me off guard. He said, "I am a radio to the cosmos."
That's very good, and just a little mystical. You want a bit of that.
Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting. Because there you were in the thick of this brave new world. You weren't Schoenberg's children. You were Schoenberg's great grandchildren. The world had progressed a long way since the advent of dodecaphonic music. And you're in the world now of the Boulez's and the Stockhausens and the, Martin Feldmans and, Milton Babbitt's. This is a very different.
Vladimir Yushachevsky.
Yes, absolutely.
Came to visit. Robert Moog came to visit. And
yep.
Yeah, we met them all.
Well, and that's really interesting. And of course, you mentioned Moog, and of course, the advent of the synthesizer, which could be because it was connected to a regular keyboard. It required presumably a lot of preparation, and live, there were only so many things you could do spontaneously, I assume. But the Moog synthesizer and the ARP synthesizer and some of those early models were really a liberation. That actually raises a very interesting question for me. How did your corner of the electronic music world respond to the popularization of electronic instruments with things like Switched on Bach, or in Canada, Syrinx and John Mills Cockle, or in Japan, Isao Tomita, and these things that were basically applying these cutting edge instruments very virtuosically, but in much more traditionally minded ways, so that essentially the ordinary folks could actually get a handle on what these instruments were like and begin to get used to them.
Well, we were into it all, I'll tell you. And this is the beautiful thing about those earliest days of electronic music, was because we were essentially creating a new language. There was no established vocabulary. There was no established compositional doctrine. There was it was tabula rasa, carte blanche.
Mm-hmm.
It was up to you to create the elements of the language you were going to be working with. And I mean, I mentioned, that we would drag these instruments out of the studio. Eventually, you mentioned the Moog, the ARP, the Synclavier, the EMS Synthi A, made in Putney, England, was housed in a little Samsonite, like a briefcase, and a very charismatic and innovative gentleman named Otto Joachim, composer, performer, based in Montreal. He was the first Canadian to secure a franchise for the importation and the marketing and sales of the EMS Synthi A. And so I think within 6 months of these instruments arriving in Canada, we somehow managed to get our hands on first one. So there were four of us. There was Jim Montgomery, David Grimes, Larry Lake, and me. And so we had just by being together in the studio and around the studio and sharing our excitement about the opportunity to create a new language with these instruments, we decided, well, the Canadian Electronic Ensemble would be a logical next step. And so we did form this group. We made the decision, I think, in 1971, and we actually held our first live performance outside of the studio in 1972. So, last year, 2022, was our 50th anniversary.
Oh.
Because we're still an established group. Larry Lake has passed from this mortal coil. David Grimes now lives in Massachusetts. Jim Montgomery and I are original members, still with the group, and we have added. We call it, the new guys.
Yeah.
Paul
Yeah.
Stillwell, who's been with the group now for 30 years.
The kids, the
Yeah.
babies.
David Sutherland actually is the most recent adherent, and he's only been with us for about 5 years.
Yeah.
But anyway, so it just seemed to be the next logical thing to do, and whereas people like Mills Cockle, people like Wendy Carlos, uh, focused on maybe the more, well, in the case of Switched on Bach, I must say I don't believe Wendy Carlos, it was Walter Carlos at the time, but
Yes.
became Wendy Carlos. His work, their work,
Yes.
was pretty much a studio product. I don't think there was ever a live performance
No.
aspect because it was so tightly controlled. It was basically perfected and finished in the studio and revealed at that time.
Right.
But Mills Cockle definitely, and Peter German is another name I will just throw into the mix. Peter German actually played the sackbut, the Eula Kane invented sackbut. When he started his performance, when we met Peter German, he had become like a jingle composer, and he would have the latest synthesizers. I remember he sold us the synthesizer because he had bought the Jupiter 8, which was the last analog Roland synthesizer before this development called MIDI.
Yeah.
And he had bought it like 6 months, and then MIDI was introduced just after that. And he wouldn't he wanted to move on, so I think we got a bargain on our Jupiter 8 from Peter, and it's a beautiful instrument, a really lovely analog synthesizer.
Right.
We used it extensively, and that's, of course, the thing is, the instrumentation was constantly changing, not just the synthesizers, but also the processing gear, things like vocoders.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and sequencers and all manner of eventually, samplers, and as you mentioned. So, and I think the thing we noticed was, with every addition to the instrumentation, these would spawn a whole series of new pieces.
Right.
And so, the relationship between the gear, the musical mind, the creative force within the people working with them, and the technological innovation, it all interacted in
Right.
wonderful and complex ways to create.
And as you say, it was constantly on the move because the technology was constantly on the move.
Yeah.
And so when you perform as an ensemble now, do you ever use any of the old instruments, or
we
have they just,
do.
yeah?
We do, especially Jim Montgomery. Actually, Jim and David Sutherland, both have Synthias. Jim has the original Synthia. David Sutherland has what's called a Synthia AKS, which
Yes.
had a built-in sequencer, was a later generation of the Synthi A. And then, of course, the Synthi A, it was just one example of one of
Yeah.
those historical instruments. But, these instruments all exist now as what we call soft synths. So
Hmm.
software emulations
Yes. Oh,
of
absolutely. For
of the
sure.
hardware. Yeah,
For
and
sure.
we use those too.
Yep. Well, it's interesting. Just a few months back, the Toronto Symphony programmed the Triangolila Symphony, and of course they brought and owned Martineau, but they didn't have to. I
Right.
mean, you just don't need
Yeah.
to do it anymore.
Yeah.
But it's so much nicer when you do. It
Yeah.
feels so much more right.
Well, it's authentic.
It's
You know.
authentic.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And actually, using the word authentic, let me just again, it's a digression, but it's an important one. That in those days, immediately while I was a graduate student at the Faculty of Music, and immediately after when I entered the broadcasting career, the whole early music thing started
Yeah.
started in the
I was going to say that, when you play your Hugh LeCane sackbut, you are part of the period instrument movement, whether you like
yes,
it or not, in every
exactly.
possible way.
And I remember talking to people over at Tafu Music, for example, and people in other early music groups, the Toronto Consort, and
Hmm.
the thing we have in common, both of us, is we're both interested in authentic performance,
Yeah.
even though the the details are vastly
Yeah,
contrasting.
different.
Yeah,
Different indeed, indeed.
yeah,
Well, let's move to the CBC, because here you are, and while I know that you're a lovely person, not everyone involved in the sort of the avant-garde of music has been a lovely person. Pierre Boulez was famously pugnacious, for example, and there have been a few of those who, not only wanted to be revolutionary in the music they created, but just like the idea of the idea of a good knockdown drag out fight with conservatives and so on. But here you were. I'm sure that from the standpoint of the people at more traditional classical music organizations like the Toronto Symphony, you were a group of wild men way out in the fringe. And there's the CBC with their board of governors, very, very conservative folks drawn from, the hangover of, shall we say, those good old post colonial, quasi Victorian days of Queen and high tea and uh, saluting the flag. What did they make of you? How receptive to experimental music, as it was sometimes called, were they at the CBC? And why the heck did they let you through the door?
Well, first of all, um, I I wasn't doing experimental music in my first couple of years.
Hmm.
I was hired because they needed a guy who would come in every bloody morning and program 4 hours of classical music for the morning drive show. That ran
Hmm.
from 6 to 10, uh, Monday through Friday, 6 to 9 on Saturday, and 6 to 8 on Sunday before choral concert. You know, and this was a lot of programming. This was a lot of hours of programming, and they needed a reasonably knowledgeable person with a lot of
Yep.
energy and willing to show up at any hour of the day. And so it wasn't actually until uh, I got sort of settled. Actually, it was Glenn had a role to play in this because
Hmm.
I started in '73. 74 was the approaching Schoenberg centenary. He never explained how he had arrived at this point, but John Peter Lee Roberts, who was head of music, he's the man who hired me.
And
Uh,
he was our founder and our first president.
exactly, and remains an enthusiastic participant. Um, uh, I'm sure that Glenn had gone. Glenn and John, of course, were great friends,
Yes.
and uh, I'm sure that before I even set foot on the office floor, he was probably already working on John this anniversary is approaching. We're going to need to celebrate this. This is important to me, Glenn Gould. One of my avatars is about to reach a centenary. And John probably said something like, well, yeah, we could probably arrange some place, maybe late at night in the schedule or at some point. And, but we're
where
going to
people
need,
won't notice it.
well, it turned out to be, on, I think, Wednesday night at 8 o'clock. So it wasn't so late, but um, um, uh, maybe it wasn't originally in the conversation quite like that. But however it happened, he had management behind him that fateful day when he strolled into my office and introduced himself, not by saying, hi, I'm Glenn, but excuse me, sir, if I asked you if you could think of a piece of music, was composed in the 1920s and it was meant to be, it was a private occasion where chamber ensemble and dancers, composers and choreographers would be gathering, and he described the orchestration that five winds, five strings, piano, and as fate would have had it, I had just programmed the week before on my morning classical music show, the Poulenc Obad,
So you
which
knew.
was precisely the work that he was quizzing me about. And when I came up with the proper answer, I think I passed the test. I think
So you were in the club. You were in the club.
I proved that I was worthy of being the guy who would be the person to arrange studios and book guests and technicians and do the editing, and we were in basically at that point. And I will say, just to harken back to my days in the electronic studio, in the 1970s, the medium, aside from live electronic, which we hastened to add to the roster, tape music was the medium of early electronic music. And one of the first things we learned in electronic music course was splicing tape. So tape on a splicing block, cut with a razor blade, and then spliced with splicing tape. I tell you, by the time I arrived at CBC Radio as the junior member of the music department, the technicians, by the way, in 1973 still had jurisdiction over tape editing.
Right.
So it was a unionized shop, and technicians had jurisdiction. It wasn't long before they found out I was a heck of a tape editor, and most technicians who got to know me, they would say, "Here, you just take it. You'll have it done in half the time."
Right.
So
that's great. That's great.
So I was allowed, after we taped our scripts, the technician would hand me the tape, and Glenn and I would make our way off to the editing room, and I would put the tape on the machine. And he insisted even though all the edits were marked in the script, we know exactly where we would have to make cuts. He insisted we start from the very beginning, play the tape, and as we approached the first edit, he started conducting, and he would say, "And there," and I would stop the machine and mark the tape, and we would spool it forward and find where it rejoined in the proper place. Glenn was all about, the action, the
yes,
involvement in the creative act, and
there's always been this, I would say, a bit of a debate between, let's say, the Gould skeptics or the Gould poo-pooers, which to the effect that all that sort of thing was kind of an affectation. He didn't really need to do that. It was just an act to put on a persona. My gut feeling is that it was 100% authentic, that the gestures, the singing, the conducting one hand with the other, all of that stuff was that he was in dead earnest when he said, if I could do it and get the same results without doing that, I promise I would. He just couldn't help himself. It was part of his process. Do you agree with that? Was that your experience?
He was completely involved. He was all in. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
I totally agree with you, and I witnessed this on so many different levels, and eventually you realized it was part of the culture. It was part of him, his process, his thinking, his world, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
and and you were, I would say, fortunate enough to be included as a part of it.
Right.
Um,
So let's back up and talk a bit about that series. This is the Schoenberg Centennial. Now, for those of you who are not deeply involved in music of the 20th century and beyond, Arnold Schoenberg is one of the pivotal figures in the entire history of music, a man who stood at a certain point in the evolution of particularly the harmonic language and its evolution, came to the conclusion that, as they used to say about Kansas City, it had gone about as far as it could go, and that it needed to basically be rethought and taken in a completely different direction. A much more, I won't say, well, it was free from structure for a little while until he decided that he needed a system and came up with the idea of the tone row. But he created a new organizing principle for all of music, and this has had a revolutionary impact. The 20th century was a period that it was full of musical revolutionaries, but most of them did not leave a legacy behind them. There isn't a natural Stravinsky school, for example. Um, there definitely isn't a Harry Partch school, and there definitely isn't a Moondog school, and there isn't a Conlon Nancarrow school. These were all really wild individualists who were experimenting in really dramatic and fascinating ways. I recommend you investigate all of their music because it's exciting and it's wild and weird and crazy. But Schoenberg was the one who basically changed the entire musical world and also created a rift between his way of seeing the world and those of his descendants, and those who really believed, as Schoenberg himself confessed, that there's still a lot of great music to be written in C major, and wanted to continue down the path of traditional music compositional harmonic structures. That's a very gross and crude way of saying it, but Schoenberg was the man. And consequently, Gould, who was no dull egg, he understood, and he idolized Schoenberg, particularly because he saw Schoenberg not as a complete break with the past, but as a way of reaching back into the past. Those who believed in music as a form of kind of sonic architecture, like Bach, his other, as you say, avatar, but basically creating a new kind of structure, a new way of organizing and thinking of music. But he still saw Schoenberg as a structuralist, as a contrapunctalist to a large extent. So the basic things that he most valued in music were there in Schoenberg's music. Consequently, he idolized him, whereas your average person raised on Mozart and other, let's shall we say, tuneful composers would listen to Schoenberg and be horrified by the fact that there were no, as Tom Lehrer once said, tunes that you could hum. So Schoenberg to this day remains a very polarizing figure, and but Gould was all in for Schoenberg, and the opportunity to say this was the man, this was the creative force who revitalized the entire Western musical canon. Must have been irresistible for him. I'm sorry for that digression, but some of our listeners come from a less technically oriented background and may not be quite as familiar with this. So I thought I'd throw that in. And if I've committed any gross errors, please correct me.
I think your thumbnail summary is spot on, and you really kind of paint a picture of what was involved in this. And of course, I mean, Schoenberg came from the late Romantic. He came out of that. His Gura leader are a monumental piece, examples of late Romantic music. He knew what he was doing, and he was friends with Mahler. He and Mahler, they hung out together. They admired one another, um, and Glenn, I guess, because Glenn had the kind of mind that he had, super organized, super fast, I think. He just gobbled this up because this was the sort of approach to music that I think he accepted it as much of a challenge as it might be, but it played to his strong suit. Was that music contained information, that it communicated with us, and in ways that no other art form could or can. And I mean, Glenn's own compositions, you can trace the roots to the 12-tone technique in his early pieces for solo piano. Clearly, right in the camp of late Schoenberg, post Schoenberg serial writing, and his famous string quartet.
Yes.
Also, well, actually, the string quartet is a pretty interesting example of a kind of Straussian / Schoenbergian.
I think you today you'd call it a mashup.
Yeah.
It is a what would you say, a mashup between the Metamorphosen and Verklärte perhaps.
Yes. And so I mean, Glenn made no secret of the fact that he loved this music. He had recorded everything that involved the piano, and so he had mapped out a series of 10 programs, which would be 1 hour long programs, and they were scripted in a conversational style. So Ken Haslam, who was the staff announcer in those days, again, a unionized shop, the announcers had their union. You had to book a staff announcer on every series that you brought in an external host for. And Glenn was fine with this because actually what he wrote in his script, he wrote both parts. He wrote not only what he felt, but he told Ken had the script to show what he felt. And even when Ken was saying, "Oh, wait a minute, Glenn, I'm not so sure I quite agree with where you're going with this," well, that was in the script.
Right. Which, of course, suggests that rather than being traditional radio documentary where you're trying to capture a slice of reality, it is really a form of drama. And so it's essentially a radio play in which the parts are fully mapped out and in which Glenn was always prepared to at least acknowledge that there were naysayers who would see the world differently. If you remember a famous article that he wrote in which he interviewed himself, and his interviewer, the little GG versus big GG in the dialogue, was quite antagonistic. So he didn't mind having a devil's advocate figure, even though, of course, you could be pretty sure that the Glenn Gould point of view would always get the upper hand.
Yes, for sure. And he would make fun of his producer too in his script, And I remember, I think the last of these 10 programs, it was a kind of a, summary. And he made the statement that he admitted that the name Schoenberg would probably never, ever become what you would call a household term, a household word. And so he was on side with that. He understood. And but he covered the whole gamut of Schoenberg's work. And in the course of doing these programs, also interviewed a number of people who had known and who had worked with Schoenberg, including John Cage, we mentioned already. Another was Eric Leinsdorf,
The
who
great Austrian conductor.
yes, yes, and who regaled us with marvelous stories from the old days in Vienna, and uh, and the thing was, he would use these interviews in the program, but he would also use much more. I think we talked to Leinsdorf in his penthouse apartment for at the Windsor Arms for about 2 hours, 2.5 hours,
Yeah,
and I
excellent.
think maybe 12 minutes made it into the program, but the larger portions of the conversation were used in the documentary, which he also made on Schoenberg. So
Right.
so not only did we make 10 radio programs, which were sort of constructed to let the national radio audience in on what all the fuss was about
Right.
this music, but then the documentary really was Glenn's personal statement on the impact, the significance, the history, the
Hmm.
you know the story of Arnold Schoenberg and what he did.
Right.
So um, um, yeah, we did these programs weekly. He came in with all scripted, and he came in with his own LPs. Most of them played to Dickens. You know, because he had find oftentimes we would cue into the middle of a piece, and he had made these little strips with a marker on them where he pointed to exactly the groove where you would put the stylus to cue in the exact spot.
That's
And
amazing.
yeah, I had said to Glenn, well, we probably have fresh copies in the record library. Let me just go. Oh, no, I've worked with these, and I know where it is. Fine.
He was a creature of habit, and I'm sure that those specific ticks and pops were very familiar to him and
Yeah,
gave him a sense of comfort,
and
like a good old pair of slippers.
yeah,
It's
I
very
think so.
interesting. Speaking of Schoenberg, just parenthetically, I still remember a sequence from one of the early documentaries. It might have been Glenn Gould off the record, in which he's having a conversation with Heinz Unger. I think it was Heinz Unger, who was an expat who had been part of that whole circle around Schoenberg, came to Canada. I think that he ended up being somewhat bitter. He'd been at CBC, as I recall, and been part of the pedagogical world. And they're arguing over whether Schoenberg or whether 12-tone music was a bit of a dead end. And Glenn was taking the position that it's just a matter of what you get used to, particularly when you're very young. And he created the thought experiment that if you got a bunch of children and essentially kidnapped them when they were just infants and took them to a desert island, and you played them nothing but Schoenberg, that when they got to the age where they were doing little sing-song nursery rhymes of their own, they would be doing them all in tone rows.
Yes, for sure. And I mean, I think a lot of Glenn's thinking was, external to music. It was more
Mm-hmm.
societal. He kind of understood the place music had in society, and saw the potential of where it might be taken. and
Yes.
and certainly through the work of a great artist such as himself. I think he felt that uh, he was creating. Well, I know he saw himself as the interpreter, as the recomposer of the music, and I'm sure he felt this was a mission of sorts,
Right.
a life's work to be totally devoted to.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. But I think the one thing about Glenn when it came to music like that of Schoenberg, and also to a certain extent Strauss, is that he had the advantage of being someone who was born after the First World War, because the composers who were there and lived through the First World War, who saw the transition from the old Austro-Hungarian Empire and that great age um, of an ordered, hierarchical, comprehensible society with music that fit within the same kind of framework. then saw that world collapse around them. And along with the sense of the new and the adventurous, you also get the sense of loss and regret and saying goodbye and disorientation, alienation. Those are all, and those, of course, are almost defining emotions of modernity. The alienated human being, the alienated society, the feeling of those roots that nurtured us in an earlier age being cut off and severed forever.
Right.
Glenn was born at a time when all that was behind him. So he was able to see it in an entirely positive light, in a very optimistic way. And so I think in some ways that feeling of loss and sorrow, grief, that was not part of the way that he confronted Schoenberg's music.
No, not at all. Not at all. He saw it as enabling, in fact, and a way forward. One of the Schoenberg followers, Ernst Krenek, who was, after Schoenberg, remained a very strong proponent and gave lectures about 12-tone music, wrote a book about it. Glenn idolized Ernst Krenek as well. And I remember at CBC, we brought Ernst Krenek to do a guest appearance during the CBC Toronto Festival. And Glenn was delighted.
I can imagine. In fact, I think that he played his music in his first European concert tour, including his performances in Russia.
Yes, I think you're right about that. Yeah.
So here you are. This is a monumental task. You're doing a tribute to, perhaps the defining musical figure, at least in the classical music world, of the 20th century. Someone who, in terms of the impact, could be ranked alongside Bach and Beethoven as really defining figures. So you've got a huge responsibility there. And you're also working with a bona fide eccentric genius who you want to make happy with the end result. So you've got a lot of pressure there. You didn't develop an ulcer during this process, did you?
No, I thoroughly enjoyed every moment of it, to be honest. Even the late night phone calls.
Well, tell us about those. I mean, I think people are really interested in Glenn as a personality. For so many years, the idea of the austere last Puritan, the hermit, the, possibly asexual loner, nocturnal, strange, proliferated. And yet his friends and the people who worked with him talk about someone who is warm and kind and playful, endlessly doing these guessing games of all kinds, a great reader, someone really involved in the world, even though at a bit of a remove. Can you fill in that picture just in terms of some of the encounters and experiences you had?
For sure. I mean, the Gould paradox is that such a reclusive person could have, through his work, could have been such a great communicator. If you see pictures of Glenn as a boy, you find there's almost always a dog in the picture.
Yes.
He loved dogs. He had pets, but when he became a world famous artist, I think his hands were insured by Lloyd's of London.
Yes.
And there was a rider, a condition of the policy that said you may not have pets because of the risk that they might scratch him or bite him or somehow might lay a claim as a result. So he loved our dog Lamb. And he loved to come and play with Lamb. She had a long snout. She was very, very curly. He said she looked just like Mendelssohn. And when we finished our 10 programs on Schoenberg, I had a print made of Lamb and put it in a little plastic frame and gave it to him. And he thanked me and he said, well, he put it by his bedside.
Oh, that's so sweet.
But he loved to come over and play with Lamb. And he once brought Roxalana Rosluck when they were recording Hindemith songs. She had recently lost her dog, and the conversation had gotten round to this, and he said, "Oh, if you're going to get another dog, you can't choose a dog until you've got to meet Lamb, because she is the perfect dog. And he arrived late one night with Roxy, and he was one of the first people to have a mobile phone in the car.
Right.
It was this big console with a lock, a key, and you had to connect with the mobile operator who would then put you through. Well, he pulled up out front and called and said, "Is it okay? I've got Roxalana Rosluck here, and she just really needs to meet Lamb." and so, he was capable of that kind of spontaneity. That just, that only like a fun-loving, real human being, a real, a true friend,
yes.
a collaborator would do. So no, we related to Glenn as a very close friend, and we loved his visits, even if they sometimes happened at odd hours or unexpectedly. But so she came and she met Lamb, and he's, isn't she perfect? Like, how can you choose a dog without first figuring out what a perfect dog could be like? Anyway,
because every other dog will have to be assessed on the Lamb index.
That's right. Yes, right. The gold standard.
The gold standard, exactly right.
As it were.
So when you were in this professional relationship and friendship with him, did he talk about his other projects, the things that he was working on that he wanted to do? Did you ever hear him play, practice, rehearse, do a spontaneous opera transcription, singing 5 parts?
He did talk about his other projects. I remember when he was doing the piano forehands, or the 2 piano versions of Wagner. I think he was very proud of the fact that he had used multi-track tape.
Yes.
To make these, and he loved to come around and just play things for people before they were released, because he was so fired up and so enthusiastic about them. And with the Sibelius recordings, for example, where he zoomed in and out of the perspective, the audio perspective, he thought he was really onto something pretty special there. And he liked to get people's reaction. He didn't necessarily want you to critique. In fact, he was quite averse to criticism.
Yeah.
Like, criticize at your peril. But he wanted you there to be with him, to be a co-listener,
right?
And to confirm that what he was hearing was what you're hearing, and that's it.
Right.
And I remember once when he was playing the Bizet piano pieces, and I made the mistake of saying, I can't imagine why anybody would want to record Bizet's piano music, and like, the airwaves went silent for probably 3 months.
Yeah.
Thou shalt not criticize.
Well,
or question.
I think he was very thin-skinned, very, very sensitive about these sorts of things.
He was a very sensitive person. Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah.
And he, from everything I hear, he wouldn't fight. For example, if I show someone my favorite movie and they tell me they think it stinks, I'll have a fight with them. Yeah. It can actually become quite heated, quite personal. But I don't think that his way of dealing with that feeling of disappointment was like that. I think it was to retreat, because I think he couldn't stand conflict, and he also couldn't stand suffering. He couldn't stand the idea that by raising his voice or showing disapproval overtly, that he would hurt you, but he might feel hurt himself and simply withdraw.
I think he just felt that, as intelligent beings, we should be smart enough to figure out how to get along.
Yes.
And, that was, very much the case.
There's a revolutionary idea, isn't it?
What a concept.
Yes, exactly. So what were some of the last experiences? What were the last times you saw him or spoke with him?
Actually, I remember when the death of Howard Hughes was reported.
Yes.
Another famous recluse. Walked around in Kleenex boxes.
Yes.
Total hypochondriac. I said once on the phone to Glenn, I said, I said, I wonder if you've been following this story about Howard Hughes. And he says, oh, yes, he's very well aware. And, he was not, um, he was not without perspective, I guess you would
Yes.
say. I think he knew what he was about. And, and maybe he knew that at that time, maybe he knew he had ventured into some maybe more extreme behavior than he'd been involved with before.
Mm-hmm.
But no, he followed the news. He kept his mind on world affairs
Mm-hmm.
and of course the stock market.
Yes, right. Where he did rather well.
Where he did very well, yes. Um, so, but I think there were places you couldn't go,
right?
I mean, for example, another example was when he was writing the Petula Clark article.
Yes.
I remember getting a late night phone call, and he just wanted to read it, the draft that he had at the time, probably not the final draft. He just wanted to read it to somebody. He didn't want your comments really.
Mm-hmm.
Just say, yeah, be that other pair of ears,
right?
To share with, complex person, but aren't we all?
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, that Petula is very aware that Glenn had this particular fondness for her work, not unmixed, but fondness for her work, and it's meant a great deal to her. And she has said to me that there are times when she was touring and it became overwhelming, and she just felt the need to stop, be away. She would go into her dressing room, lie on the floor, and play the Goldberg variations and think about Glenn.
Nice. Beautiful.
Yeah. She's very sorry that she never had a chance to meet him in person.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to talk as we finish up, and I do want to talk about your own work again and your compositions and some of your recent projects. But before we get to that, I want to ask about two other things and whether Glenn discussed those with you. First of all, the third pole of his tripod of avatars, and that's Richard Strauss, and how someone who I think in the minds of the average person who loves classical music couldn't be more different than Schoenberg, because here's someone whose music really sounds romantic right down to the very end, the four last songs and the clarinet concerto and those late works that the woodwind works. How did he reconcile that love of Strauss, particularly because some of Strauss's music has qualities that I think of as being almost antithetical to Glenn's character? For example, bombast.
Again, it's highly contrapuntal music,
right?
And Glenn, I think his mind was engaged by the play of contrapuntal lines, and I think he connected to the process very effectively and very efficiently, and I think if there was bombast in Strauss, perhaps for Glenn, I'm just speculating now. I think it might have simply translated as ecstasy, because I think with Strauss, there's no gratuitous bombast.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think. I think it's all prepared and resolved, and it's the through line of what's going on in the music, and in the counterpoint.
Right.
So I just think it probably for Glenn was intensely satisfying.
And of course, his approach to opera clearly was a different beast for Glenn than just about any other opera, and particularly Verismo or anything that was really part of the 19th century Italian tradition, for which I think it must have been a bit of an anathema to him.
Yeah, perhaps, yes. But I don't think, to be honest, Coming back to Bizet and the piano pieces, I remember his answer when I asked him, well, why would you do this? He said, well, I thought he's the most Wagnerian of the French romantics.
Yeah, he probably needed to put on the Chausson Symphony.
Yeah,
That's pretty
yeah,
Wagnerian too. But
right.
anyway, the last bit, just in terms of his musical taste, and this really, he must have been aware of the world that you came from. And my
Yeah,
sense is that, as with his wandering through 19th century music, his relationship with 20th century music was also very, very selective. So I think of him in some ways as being um, open to the new, but also in a way conservative. It's hard for me to imagine him, grooving to, Subotnick or Babbitt, Boulez, Stockhausen, Della Piccola, those kinds
yeah.
of
Well, each one of those would it be a different case, I dare
yes.
say. And I remember playing in one of my pieces, one of my electronic pieces, and it had like oscillators glissing
Hmm.
over a 3 octave range, and he referred to those as chromatic scales. Yeah, I don't care for chromatic scales, he said. Uh, but I once I had prepared a list of and this is 80-ish, a list of my works to date, and he had a look at it, and he said, "Oh well, it's I guess comparable to about the same list. It came total duration on Webern because they were, of course, not terribly long at the time.
Right.
But I think that was his way of giving a kind of a backhanded compliment,
Yeah.
or seeming
Per-
seeming to feign positive reaction.
perhaps. Well, one thing's for sure, he seems to have loved Shostakovich, but he loathes Stravinsky.
Yeah, yeah. Well, because Stravinsky was largely homophonic. I mean, uh, the Symphony of Psalms notwithstanding, um, and well, other pieces too. But I think he probably lumped Stravinsky in with the French Impressionists.
Hmm.
That it was narcissistic, that it was, it had to sound brilliant in order to be effective.
Right. It was coloristic. I still
Colorist,
remember him talking about being traumatized by being taken to see Fantasia, all that color.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right. So perhaps the same thing in a sound world. So before we close, we haven't really done justice to your own work as a composer, and at the very least, I'd like to find out about some of your recent work and some of the things that you've been up to and what you have on the horizon.
Just yesterday, a review appeared. I don't know if you read the blog textura.org.
No, I'm not familiar with it.
Well, I recommend it highly. It's an extremely well written blog, and they cover all kinds of music. And the author pointed out, he said, this has been a pretty good year for David Jaeger, the composer, because not only has he had, like, in March, a complete album of his viola music released. Well, he's just had another one on another label, and having written 18 pieces for the viola, to have 2 albums released in a given year, entirely devoted to your work, and on different labels. And then he pointed out that plus one of my productions on a Spanish label, uh, Pianist Classical, of the brilliant young prodigious cellist Noemi Raymond Frise,
Hmm.
who not only played Poulenc Sonata and the Schnittke First Sonata, also played an unaccompanied cello piece of my own.
Oh, that's
So
wonderful! Congratulations! And do you have a particular relationship with the viola?
I do. I do. I mean, it's only one aspect of my work, but it's a very significant one. My mother was a violist,
Oh, nice.
but I'm the second of 6 children in my family. And when my mother started raising her family, she made the decision. She put her instruments away, and I
Mm.
discovered them. I tell this story time and again because it's a fascinating story. I, as a kid, maybe not a toddler, but as a youngster, I stumbled into this closet and I saw these boxes, and was if you put a bow away in the box for
Yes.
long, like the bow hair will unravel, and eventually the threads of hair will find their way out of the box. It's like a snake or something.
Right.
So I
I,
discovered these boxes with this hair coming out,
it's
and
a great hairy mess.
yeah, and I asked my mother, and she said, "Oh, those are my violas," and I never heard her play, uh,
Uh,
but 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 the viola always held a kind of a mystery for me. And then I started meeting the great violists of this world, and most particularly Rivka Golani,
oh yes.
who asked me for my first piece, and asked it on very short notice. I think I had about 10 days to compose the piece, which turns out is one of my most performed works to this very day. Um, but Rivka then came back. I've written for her probably 9 or 10 pieces just specifically for Rivka. We have a
That's great.
very trusting relationship. But then now the younger violists are coming along and they're discovering this and are keen to do it. So, I think for any composer, aside from the fact that the single most important thing for them is to hear their music played, like the second important thing is to hear different interpretations.
Yes, yes.
And I was at CBC as a music producer for 40 years. And I like to say, if I learned one thing in those 40 years, it is the value of the interpreter. The value that the interpreter brings to the music is very high. And we obsess about composers, we obsess about repertoire and historical periods. And I think we sometimes forget that it's the interpreters who breathe life into those dots on the page.
Hmm.
And you know, I've been very vocal in saying to the people who've given me the privilege of interpreting my music, I just want to believe you. What you play it your way. Like, I'm
Yeah.
not going to tell you how to play it. I want it to be authentic you. I want to hear how that music works through your creativity as a performer, as an interpreter, because I want it to be real and I want it to be believable. And I've been lucky that I've had a number of my works interpreted more than a few times, and it's such a great thrill for me as a composer to see how varied this can be,
Oh
you know,
yes.
and in the hands of beautiful players, really creative, uh, wonderful musicians. It's been a real treat for me.
That's great. Well, I certainly been my experience that if you look at some of the what I'd call the major works of the 20th century, works that came along when recording existed, and you hear the first recording, especially if those recordings happened very close to the world premiere,
Yeah,
and you realize they sound very different from the way we hear those pieces now. The pieces haven't settled in. The ideas of interpretation, it's still new and unfamiliar. So it's
yeah,
moving in a lot of different directions than the same piece as we've become accustomed to it. So there is an evolution that happens. It reminds me of something that Philip Glass said when we gave him the Glenn Gould Prize, and he got up on the stage and he said, "I never met Glenn Gould, but he was a towering presence in my life as an interpreter. I was always aware of him." And some people have said, "Well, he was so wayward in his interpretations. It's a good thing he never played any of your music because he would have changed it around." To which I say, he would have been extremely welcome to do so. To have a musical mind like that alter my music would have been a
yeah,
privilege. It would be like being a partner.
yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm very fortunate that I did have a career as a producer, and my producing life has definitely informed my composing life, and my composing point of view is always with me when I'm in the studio producing. I think like a composer, and I think like, how is this music supposed to work? Like, what's the most effective? What's going to make it vivid in recording?
Right.
What's going to make it strike people as being exceptional and special? And so I'm happy to be that second pair of ears for the artist to say, well, I hear it this way. Come in the studio, listen to playback. Let's see what it's actually sounding like. And I say to each artist, like listening to playback, you can tell by putting a little more weight on the tone. Yep. You understand what the effect is going to be in the final product. And so I love those conversations. I love the engagement of the dialectic,
right?
The conversation about how it's going and how it could be and what its potential is.
And as the producer, you understand the medium, which the interpreter doesn't always, whether it's the radio medium or the recorded medium. So believe me, having spent 20 years in the record business, I can say it just don't happen without the producer.
Yeah, that's right.
Anyway, with that, I just want to thank you so much, David. We have barely glossed over the incredible lifespan of 2 New Hours, which is a legend in itself. It's an era in our Canadian Broadcasting Corporation that I'm afraid we regret to say there doesn't exist an environment for that level of inventiveness and experimentation and creativity anymore, but maybe one day it will come back. We can always hope. And for the help and friendship and the experiences that you've shared with us with Glenn, I just want to thank you for being with us today.
It's been a great pleasure, Brian.
Thank you so much.
The Glenn Gould Foundation is a registered Canadian charity, and we rely on the support of arts lovers like you to keep bringing inspiring stories to life. Please consider giving by visiting our website, glenngould.ca, and follow us across social media at the Glenn Gould Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of The Gould Standard.